It started with a knock. You know that knock. The kind that rattles your ribs at dawn, turning your coffee bitter before you even take a sip. I opened the door to find HOA President Linda, red hair in curlers, clutching a clipboard like a sword, with 2 board members flanking her like dollar store bodyguards. "You've been hunting on your property," she snapped, flipping pages. "We're fining you for violating HOA noise and safety ordinances." I looked past her at my land, fields, creeks, and thick woods that had been in my family for 3 generations. I'd spent dawn in those woods teaching my son how to track a trail, how to breathe quietly, how to respect the life you take, and now they were telling me it wasn't mine anymore. I tried to reason with them, told them the law, showed them the survey lines, the titles, the county ordinances that made it crystal clear that their HOA had no jurisdiction over my acreage. Linda just smiled, that HOA power trip smile you've seen before, and said, "We make the rules here." Then she handed me a fine for $1,200, not because I did anything wrong, but because they wanted to remind me who they thought was in charge. I went back inside, fine in hand, stomach twisted. My wife Ellie came in from feeding the goats, sweat on her brow, jaw tight. "Again?" she asked. I nodded, showing her the fine. Ellie didn't cry, didn't scream. She just looked at me, eyes dark with that quiet fire she carries, and said, "They think they can own us." For weeks, we tried to fight it the right way. Emails, calls, a meeting with their lawyer, who smiled the same way Linda did and told me fighting would cost more than paying. I saw the smug faces at the HOA meeting, Linda bragging about enforcing community standards, talking about how dangerous hunting is. The same faces I'd see hiking the public trails that ran along the creek, waving to me, pretending to care about nature, while they plotted to strip our rights. I sat in that meeting, silent, taking notes. Because if there's one thing I learned from the land, it's patience. 2 months later, a for sale sign went up by the trails. The family who owned the 30 acres of hiking trails and creek front couldn't keep up with the taxes. They listed it quietly, thinking a developer might pick it up or the county might preserve it. No one noticed except me. Because while the HOA was busy fining me for living my life, I was quietly talking to the owner, drafting the paperwork, pulling cash from the sale of an old tractor, and moving pieces like a quiet storm. The day the paperwork cleared, I stood at the edge of those trails at dawn, just like I always did. But this time, I had the deed in my pocket, and a lock for every gate. That morning, Linda and her hiking club came down the gravel road with their poles and water bottles, ready for their sunrise hike. They stopped stunned at the locked gate. Linda's face twisted when she saw me standing there, arms folded, keys in my hand. "What is this?" she demanded. I pulled out the deed slowly, letting her eyes widen as she read my name on the title. I told her, "This land is mine now, and it's closed permanently." She stammered, shouting about community rights, unreasonable actions, the spirit of the HOA. But her voice shook, because she realized, finally, what it feels like to have something you love taken from you by someone who thinks they own you. Neighbors started gathering behind her, confusion turning to panic. No more sunrise hikes, but this is our mental health walk. Where will we go now? I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I just turned, locked the second gate, and walked back to my truck, leaving them staring through the fence at the trails they once called theirs. That night I sat with Ellie on the porch, watching the stars, listening to the frogs along the creek. I told her it wasn't about revenge. It was about reminding them that freedom has a cost, that you don't get to bully people without consequences. And as the wind rustled through the trees, I felt the weight lift off my chest, because for the first time in months, the land was quiet again. They thought it would end there, that locking a few gates would be enough. That I'd have my little moment of petty satisfaction, and then eventually I'd cave, reopen the trails, apologize for the inconvenience. They didn't know me, and they didn't know the land. 2 days after I locked the gates, Linda came to my property with the HOA vice president and their legal advisor. They stood at the end of my driveway, arms crossed, trying to look intimidating, as if their polyester suits and printed bylaws could scare me on my own soil. Linda started in with her practiced HOA speech. "You're damaging the community's health and morale. These trails are important to our lifestyle, and your actions are vindictive." I stayed silent. She tried a softer tone, saying, "Look, let's be reasonable. We'll drop your fine if you unlock the gates." It was almost funny. They fined me for hunting on my own land, tried to break me with paperwork, then came crawling back when they lost something they loved. I pulled the fine from my pocket, ripped it in half in front of them, and dropped it in a metal trash can. Then I lit a match and let it burn while they watched. "You can keep your fine," I told them. "And I'll keep my land." Linda's face flushed red with fury, but the vice president put a hand on her arm, whispering something about legal recourse. They turned and left, but not before Linda snapped, "You'll regret this. You can't keep us out forever." But deep down I saw it in her eyes, the fear. She knew this was bigger than a gate. This was about power slipping from her hands. That weekend, the HOA sent out a newsletter to the entire neighborhood. They painted me as the villain, claiming I had selfishly closed off vital community resources, out of spite. They claimed I was hostile, dangerous, that I waved guns around. A complete lie, trying to turn neighbors against me. I watched as people who used to wave at me started crossing the street. Watched as lawn conversations stopped when I walked by. I won't lie, it hurt. Ellie saw it in my eyes one morning while we were feeding the goats, the silence heavier than any frost. She put a hand on my shoulder. "They can talk all they want," she said. "They don't own you. They don't own this land. Let them learn what happens when you try to bully people who just want to live free." A few days later, Linda organized a protest hike. 20 HOA members showed up with signs chanting about community rights and open spaces, standing at the locked gate taking selfies for their Facebook pages. They called the local news, trying to make me look like a tyrant. But the news crew asked to interview me too. I stood there holding up the deed, showing the survey lines, explaining the fine, and telling them exactly what happened. How the HOA tried to bleed me dry for hunting on my own land. How they tried to control me, like they control everyone else. How they forgot what it means to let people live in peace. That interview went viral. People started sending me messages. Farmers, hunters. Regular folks tired of HOA power trips. They said they were proud of me, that they wished they could stand up too. The next HOA board meeting was packed. Linda tried to keep control, but people started asking questions. "Why did you fine him for hunting? Why did you push him until he felt he had to buy the trails? Why can't you just let people live? I wasn't there, but Ellie's friends sent us a recording." Linda's voice cracked as she tried to defend the fine, claiming safety and community interest. But you could hear the shift in the room. People were tired of her, tired of the bullying, but Linda didn't give up. She filed a complaint with the county, claiming I was blocking historical public access. But the trails had never been public. They were private land graciously allowed for hiking by the previous owner. The county reviewed it and threw it out. Then came the trespassers. A few die-hard HOA members decided they would take back their trails. They cut a section of fence and snuck in one morning, thinking they were heroes. They didn't expect the trail cameras, didn't expect me to show up with the sheriff, footage in hand, pressing charges for trespassing and property damage. They tried to spin it as a misunderstanding, but the sheriff wasn't buying it. They paid fines, not me. Ellie and I sat on the porch that evening, listening to the creek, watching the sunset wash the fields in gold. She sipped her tea and smiled. "You're not the villain," she said softly. "You're the reminder they needed." And for the first time in months, I felt peace in my bones, because they could write newsletters and hold protests. But they couldn't take what I loved most. They couldn't break me, and the land was quiet once again. A week after the trespassing incident, you could feel the tension in the neighborhood like a low hum under the summer air. HOA Karen, Linda kept her head high, pretending nothing had changed, but I'd see her looking over her shoulder when she watered her roses, flinching when she'd catch me driving past in my truck. She'd lost control, and she knew it. Ellie and I were fixing a section of fence when a car pulled up. A young man stepped out, mid-30s, wearing boots that had seen real work, with a clipboard in his hand. "Mr. Carter?" he asked. I nodded, bracing for another fight. But he smiled. "I'm Mark. My family owns the adjoining 40 acres along the ridge. I heard what happened. I've had my share of run-ins with that HOA too. Thought you might be interested." He handed me a folder. Inside was a map showing property lines. County taxes are high. We're looking to sell. I'd rather it go to someone who respects the land. I looked at Ellie, her eyebrows lifting, the ghost of a smile on her lips. We didn't say a word until Mark drove off. Then she whispered, "Let's do it." The process was quiet, no announcements, no Facebook posts, just signatures, wire transfers, and a handshake with a neighbor who was tired of watching the HOA creep closer to his fences every year. When the sale cleared, we now owned almost 100 acres of forest, ridge, and creek, with every trail and cut path Linda and her group used for their community wellness walks. I put up new fencing, added cameras, and posted private property, no trespassing signs. It didn't take long before the calls started. Linda called twice, demanding I honor the neighborhood spirit and reconsider access. I didn't pick up. Then came the letters, slipped into our mailbox without postage, with words like selfish and community betrayal. Scribbled in angry handwriting, Ellie would read them and toss them straight into the burn barrel. A week later, Linda showed up with the HOA lawyer. He was a skinny man with thick glasses, sweat darkening his shirt under the sun. "We're prepared to take legal action if you don't restore access to these community trails," he said, trying to sound powerful. I didn't say a word. I simply pulled out the folder of deeds, the recorded survey maps, the county approval letters, and set them on the hood of my truck. "Go ahead," I said. They looked through the documents, their faces falling as the realization set in. They had no case. The lawyer muttered something about reviewing options, and Linda stormed off, kicking gravel. They couldn't bully me with bylaws here. They couldn't fine me, threaten me, or intimidate me. This was my land, and they hated it. That evening, Ellie and I sat by the creek, letting the cool water run over our feet. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "They thought they could control you," she whispered, "but they don't even control themselves." I replied, and we laughed, softly, tiredly, but freely. The HOA tried one last desperate move. They sent out a community petition to boycott us, telling neighbors to stop waving, to stop buying eggs from Ellie's small coop, to cut off any interaction. At first it stung. Neighbors we'd shared barbecue with now turned their heads, eyes glued to their lawns. But a funny thing happened. A few days later, one neighbor knocked on our door. A single mom, her son clutching a carton of eggs. "Can we still buy these?" she asked quietly. "We don't care about what they're saying." I smiled and handed her the eggs. She slipped me a folded bill, whispering, "Thank you." One by one, more neighbors came by. Some pretended to be out for a walk, slipping cash into Ellie's hands for eggs, honey, or goat's milk. Some came at night, headlights off, knocking softly, ashamed but unwilling to fully break. They weren't ready to stand up publicly, but they weren't ready to abandon us either, and that was enough. Late one evening, I saw Linda standing at the locked gate with two other HOA board members. They weren't yelling, they weren't holding signs, they were just standing there, looking at the forest beyond, the trails they once claimed as theirs. Linda's shoulders slumped. She turned and walked away without a word, the other two trailing behind her. In that moment, I realized they finally understood. You can't bully a man who's willing to stand alone. You can't take from people who know what it means to lose everything and still fight for what's right. Ellie came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist. "They won't try again," she said softly. I nodded. "They can't." And as the wind rustled through the trees, I felt the land breathe again, quiet. Free, ours. The leaves turned, painting the ridgeline in reds and golds. The creek running cold under the frost. Bit mornings. Life on the land moved on. Our goats still needed feeding. The fences needed mending. The woodpile needed stacking. And the HOA, they had gone quiet. But quiet doesn't mean peace. One cold Saturday morning, Ellie came in, her breath fogging in the doorway. "Linda's back," she said. I looked out the window. Linda was standing by the locked gate, arms crossed, eyes locked on the "No Trespassing" sign. I grabbed my jacket and walked down the gravel path, boots crunching in the frost. She didn't flinch as I approached. "I want to talk," she said. For a moment there was no HOA president, no clipboard, no smugness, just a tired woman standing in the cold. She started with excuses about how the community was falling apart without the hiking club. about how the board was under pressure, about how they had overreached. But her eyes never met mine. Finally, she took a deep breath. "What will it take?" she asked, voice small. I looked past her, at the trails behind the fence, at the ridge where I had taught my son to track deer, at the creek where Ellie and I washed the dirt from our hands after long days. What would it take? I thought about the months of harassment, the fines, the cold shoulders from neighbors, the lies, the trespassing, the calls in the middle of the night telling me I was a monster for protecting what was mine. I looked back at Linda and I realized I didn't owe them anything, not one more inch of land, not one moment of peace disturbed, not one more apology for living free. "I'm not interested," I said quietly. Her eyes widened. "You don't understand," she said, voice shaking. "They're blaming me. They're turning on me. I'm losing control." "That's not my problem," I replied. She opened her mouth, then closed it, tears welling up. For a moment I felt a pang of pity. Then I remembered the look on her face when she handed me that fine, smiling, thinking she owned me, and the pity disappeared. Linda turned and walked back to her car, shoulders slumped, leaving tire tracks in the frost as she drove away. I locked the gate behind me and walked back to the house. Ellie was waiting on the porch, a mug of coffee in each hand. "She's done?" Ellie asked. I nodded. "She's done." A week later, a for sale sign went up in Linda's yard. Word spread quickly. The HOA was holding emergency meetings. Rumors swirled that Linda was stepping down, selling her house, moving to another state to start over. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks, in driveways, in grocery store aisles. One evening, a knock came at our door. It was a couple from down the road, ones who had avoided us for months. The husband looked sheepish, scratching at his neck. "Mind if we talk?" We sat on the porch, the cold creeping in. They apologized for the silence, for the whispers, for letting the HOA turn neighbors into strangers. They asked if they could buy eggs again. Ellie smiled and nodded, her eyes soft. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The land was quiet again, but it was more than that. It was free. Spring came, and with it, green shoots pushing through the frost. I walked the trails at dawn, the ones that were ours now, the ones that would stay ours. Sometimes neighbors would stop at the fence, watching, waving shyly. Some would call out, asking if they could walk again. I would shake my head, not out of spite, but because some lessons need to last. Because freedom isn't free if you let it slip away for convenience. Ellie and I stood on the ridge one evening, watching the sunset bleed across the sky, turning the creek to gold. She took my hand. "You did the right thing," she whispered. I squeezed her hand. "We did," I replied, and as the stars blinked to life above us, I felt it. Peace, not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from standing your ground, from protecting what's yours, from living free no matter who tries to take it. Because in the end they learned, you don't mess with people who know the value of land, you don't bully families who know how to fight back, and you don't fine a man for living free.